All right, well, we want to thank both Jill and Matt for joining us today. It's awesome to have you guys with us. We're getting close to the end of the conference, and we saved the best for the last here, obviously. So thank you so much for your help today, guys, and for your presentation. Without further ado, I'll just pass it off to you and have at it.
Hi, thanks everybody for joining us. I'm Jill Senner.
And I'm Matthew Baud.
And today we're going to be talking about SMoRRES and partner-augmented input, steps to successful modeling.
And before we get started today, if you guys want to go ahead and download the handout, you can look at it at the website, the link listed here below. We'll also share it again, maybe over Slack at the end of the presentation, so you guys can have the direct link.
So before we really get started, I know many of you may already be familiar with the idea of partner-augmented input or aided language stimulation or aided language modeling. And although pointing to pictures while talking may be a familiar idea, having awareness about a strategy alone does not typically result in being able to use it. Many teachers, speech-language pathologists, parents require training before they can model effectively in the classroom or at home. And the discrepancy between awareness and use can be explained by examining levels of impact.
So when we look at the different levels of impact, we can look at awareness, realizing the importance of the technique that we're trying to train.
Another level of impact of in-service training is concepts and organized knowledge. This is where we have an increased understanding of some concepts and increasing knowledge. And awareness and knowledge alone will have little effect on behavior.
And then we can look at the principles and skills, giving some tools and potential for action of carrying out the technique.
But it's really the application and problem-solving level that we really want to help all of our communication partners achieve. And this is where they can transfer and use skills learned, along with other strategies in their repertoire.
So what we're going to look at today is we're talking about partner training. And Kent Walsh McNaughton devised an 8-step instructional program for communication partner, and it looked at different 8 steps. And today we're only going to have time to go through strategy description and strategy demonstration, but typically we have families and school teams that really go through all the steps to get communication partners to that application and problem solving level.
So what we know about augmentative and alternative communication, and this is a lovely graphic that Rachel Langley showed a couple of years ago, and we have borrowed because we really, really like it, is that the finish line is just the beginning of a whole new race. Getting a device, having the assessment is really just the beginning of the process.
So let's talk about the strategy description today, partner-augmented input. So when we look at infants and when they learn language, and this is my oldest at this point, he is 10, but this is his 3 months. How do they learn language?
Infants learn language not through direct instruction. We never sit down with infants and say, dog, noun, a domesticated carnivorous mammal. No, rather what we do is we model and we say, look at the dog. He feels so soft. Let's pet the dog. The dog is barking. That's loud. And we develop all kinds of connections with and around dogs. And by the way, this is my incredibly cute puppy asking for belly rubs.
And when we look at learning language, infants don't understand initially what we're saying, but we keep talking to them over and over.
And this point is really illustrated by looking at the picture on the next screen of Matt's youngest.
And from the moment a baby is born, they hear and respond to the word. We bombard the infant with the language for the first 12 to 18 months of their lives. And during that time, we don't expect they will utter a single understandable word.
And I can attest that a couple of years ago when Josephine was born, Matt was FaceTiming her at 1 or 2 weeks of age and talking the entire time, even though she wasn't understanding yet. That was how she was getting exposed to language.
So then why, when we look at learning AAC, do we expect a child to spontaneously start using the system from the first day that he or she receives it?
Simply giving a child a communication board or device does not make him or her a communicator any more than giving me a basketball makes me an athlete, or giving me a piano makes me a musician. It's simply an instrument. And the other thing that I want to point out is that we have the benefit of being able to read the words on a child's board. And many of our kiddos who are learning AAC don't have literacy skills yet. Some do, but many don't. And so if we look at the symbol on the screen, do you know what this means? And if you have any guesses, please feel free to type that into Slack. But we often get lots of varied guesses because the only pictures, as we know, on an augmentative communication system that have a clear relationship to their referent are nouns. Those are things that we can actually pretty easily picture. But, oh, someone said each, you're close. Row, that's close. Every, you got it. So this put, that was a good guess. But this is actually the symbol for every. There's an arrow pointing to every box. And so if we didn't explain that or try to use it in context, our students or our clients wouldn't have any understanding of what this symbol means, because most symbols really are quite abstract, as are most words in English language.
So when we think about this, AAC users also in need deserve a period of learning from models of others. This modeling can and should be done by parents, peers, siblings, professionals, and others on a regular basis for extended period of time.
And I love the graphic from this assistive wear graphic, the do's and don'ts of AAC. Do use the AAC system to talk yourself. Do not expect the AAC user to communicate with you without modeling how.
And from Baud and Gori, they talk about when you're looking at learning AAC, it's recommended that classroom instruction include the child's targeted AAC language to promote the child's understanding of the symbol and referent.
And Baud and Gori actually looked at using AAC in an immersion environment in an extended school year program. And they did find that using this sort of immersion approach for augmentative communication was beneficial to students in that classroom. So what is partner-augmented input?
It's also referred to as natural aided language modeling, aided language simulation, AAC modeling, but it is all the same. It's a powerful receptive training approach for children and adults who use AAC.
And how is it provided?
Well, communication partners, whether it's a school staff member, parent, peer, sibling, use the visual language themselves by pointing to the symbols on the communication device or board while simultaneously talking.
And there's quite a bit of evidence behind the use of partner-augmented input. You know, Matt and I frequently talk about the importance of evidence-based practice, and that is something that is a very important idea in medical care and in education these days, really looking at what does the research say about what we're doing with our students or with our children. And one of the things that we know is that PAI increases vocabulary comprehension. So we're talking actually about understanding the reference. So if we're trying to teach concepts or if we're trying to teach vocabulary, modeling and pointing to pictures while talking can actually increase vocabulary comprehension.
And also, if we look at another study that showed about increasing symbol comprehension as well as production. So not only on the receptive component, but when you provide the receptive training, there is an outcome for looking at the production and increasing that.
Yes, so it can increase students' understanding of vocabulary, understanding of the symbols on the device, as well as their ability to produce. It also provides models for appropriate language and communication, and it also provides children with a model for how AAC can be used, in what context and for what purposes. Reinforces the effectiveness of using the system, so children experience the utility and power of the system, and it makes an implicit statement to children that AAC provides an acceptable vehicle for communicating.
And using partner-augmented input is an effective method for teaching those early semantic syntax relations, some of those agent plus object kind of functions that we look at teaching at the early language levels.
It also increases production of multi-symbol messages and can improve utterance length and complexity.
Increases the responsiveness and use of AAC.
And increases in use of grammatical morphemes such as past tense ed and plural s. And I do want to point out, we don't have time in this 50-minute presentation to go into detail into all of these studies, but these studies were done with different groups, different ages, different types of disabilities, and all of them came up with similar results, that this was effective with their age group and nature of the disability.
So why do we want to use partner-augmented input? Well, the purpose of providing partner-augmented input is to establish that solid receptive language base upon which the child's AAC use is built. The expectation is that expressive language will eventually follow. The child should be encouraged, but not required to use symbols during their interactions.
And this is an infographic by Caroline Musselwhite that emphasizes that point. She says, down with demands and up with invitations. And we'll actually talk momentarily about how to create opportunities for inviting our children to communicate rather than saying things like, tell me on your talker.
And we can also look at why we're going to do partner-augmented input. We know AAC is not a test. This is a graphic from Rachel Langley. It's about sharing, refusing, joking, complaining, questioning. We have a lot of things that we know about teaching that language. And when caregiver utterances that are both synchronized with the child's focus and are undemanding on quality are correlated with better language development. And in that study, that was done with typically developing children.
That was done with kiddos with autism, but kids who did not use devices. So that was used with kids who used their speech to communicate. And Linda Barkerhart talks about avoiding using manned models in which there's an expectation that the child will say what we want them to say. We want them to say what they want to say, what they're moved to say.
And one other reason we look at partner-augmented input is that Gail Van Tatenhove suggests that partner-augmented input will slow down the speech rate of the partner. And again, Jill and I talk about this a lot. We are fast talkers, but when we're pointing to symbols, it will slow us down. We'll also shorten a partner sentence length to match more of what their current expressive level is at.
And by doing that, forces emphasis of keywords and ideas. It also emphasizes gaps in core vocabulary. When you start using the child's communication device to communicate yourself, and you're finding that lots of words that you want to say are missing from your child's device, then that is a tip that perhaps we need to think about adding some of that language to the communication device. And then lastly, it builds natural support networks. It's not uncommon that I will walk into a classroom and have staff say, well, Johnny knows the device better than we do. But in order to be able to teach Johnny to increase his language and language skills, we need to actually be able to support him and help build that language. And so we need to know the language as well or better than he does.
To become a proficient user of an augmentative communication system, the child must undergo a substantial portion of his or her training within as many environments in which he or she is expected to communicate. Yes,
and that is a quote by Carol Goosens, who has done quite a bit of pioneering work in terms of talking about partner-augmented input. But really, to achieve mastery, the child must be inundated with seeing the system being used frequently, interactively, and generatively. So really, to maximize acquisition, AAC training is best conducted with an immersion approach. And we go back to the Baud and Gorey paper, where they actually created an immersion approach in a summer school environment. And what do we think about when we think about immersion training? We think about second language learning. I don't know how many of you have had an opportunity to learn a second language, but when I was learning my second language, French, the very first day that I walked into class, my instructor said to me, "Pas d'anglais." She announced to the class, "No more English. We are not going to use English for the rest of this class period." And she proceeded to teach us in an immersion environment by illustrating, lots of times showing us things as she was speaking. And that really helped us to be able to learn that language.
So when we look at second language acquisition, we can look at some of the terminology to kind of think about how long they might need. So we look at BICS, or basic interpersonal communication skills. It'll take 2 to 3 years to achieve proficiency in a very supportive immersion, a type of environment. And again, that's kind of that social chatter, that cafeteria, or Jill talks a lot about bargaining in French to get something that she wants.
Yes, in a market. I can bargain in a market, I can order in a restaurant, I can ask where the restroom is. But what I don't have is cognitive academic language proficiency. That actually takes a lot longer to achieve. That takes 5 to 7 years, because some of the cognitive and academic language for things like speech language pathology are very specific. We're talking about a lot of fringe language here that require a lot of experience to be able to use in your everyday communication.
So we know, taking some of that terminology, we understand that patience that is required for the amount of modeling is needed for our AAC users.
And when we think about BICS and CALP, those numbers are based on typically developing individuals who move here from another country. So we're talking about individuals who don't have other learning difficulties, who don't have visual or hearing impairment, etc. So we really need our individuals who are using AAC to be exposed to language modeling for a good long period of time. And when we think about language learning really is bimodal. AAC users hear and understand language in an auditory environment, but produce language in part through a visual mode.
But what we want to make sure we provide with that input versus output is they need that speech and picture for input because of what they are producing with the visual output.
If we fail to have a matching input and output, what we end up with is something that is referred to as an asynchrony of input and output. And this is a quote from Baud and Gorey. Often familiar and unfamiliar communication partners use an oral language system with an individual learning an AAC-based language. In a sense, this dichotomy requires the AAC user to code switch between a verbally symbolic language and a visually symbolic language system. And unfortunately, frequently, this results in communication breakdowns because maybe the student or the child understands what you're saying, and they even understand how to respond to you, but maybe they don't know where to find it in their communication system to be able to reply effectively.
So when we look at AAC competency, we know it takes time. If we think about their immersion approach, we understand it has a few years. So if we look at this quote from Jane Corsten, the average 18-month-old child has been exposed to 4,380 hours of oral language at a rate of 8 hours per day from birth. A child who uses a communication system and receives speech and language therapy 2 times per week for 20-minute sessions will reach the same amount of language exposure in 84 years.
Wow, that's really eye-opening, and I think it's fabulous that Jane Corsten put together this calculation for us all, because we don't have 84 years. Modeling needs to happen more than just in the little speech room. It needs to be happening throughout the day, and Carol Goosen suggests it should be occurring in at least 80% of ongoing activities and environments.
So when we're talking about providing partner-augmented input, we're thinking about how do we provide this input effectively? So one way we look at is providing slow speech rate. We know that by the nature, when we point to pictures on a communication board or device, it will slow us down. But we also want to make sure that we speak in a very slow and clearly articulated manner while we're pointing to the pictures.
The other thing that we want to do is to model. We want to say words and phrases that are related to the contextual information available while pointing to pictures on the child's board or device. So for example, while looking at a book, the adult might say, "I see a dog. I like dogs." Now, I do want to point out that a lot of times communication partners struggle to think about what to model. And if we draw from the speech language pathology literature, we have 2 strategies that are frequently used with children who are developing verbal language, and those are parallel talk and self-talk.
So when we look at using parallel talk, we're describing those ongoing actions and interests and feelings of the child. So if they're playing with the blocks, we're being that color commentator for the language that's available for us to talk about. And then we can look at self-talk, describing those ongoing actions and interests of ourselves. Whether you're playing on the iPad, you're talking about what you're doing it as you're doing it. You get to talk to yourself, but we're modeling on the communication device at the same time.
And with parallel talk, we really can talk about what the student or child is thinking, seeing, feeling, hearing, or doing. So we can be using action words, we can be using descriptors, we can be modeling a wide variety of language as the color commentator.
And the other thing about the modeling that we always talk about, it really opens up to commenting and avoiding some of those yes-no questions. When we're using the parallel talk and self-talk, we're not opening up to something that we're all guilty of asking that yes-no question. And then after we do it, try to rechange it around and make it very unnatural. So by providing that parallel self-talk, you're providing that comment language as you're doing the activity.
Yes, and as Matt had indicated, when you ask a child a yes-no question, a perfectly acceptable response is a head shake or a nod. And if we then say, oh, now tell me on your talker, we're creating a very unnatural communication situation where we're, again, placing a demand on the child. So let's talk about ways that we can increase those invitations without necessarily creating a demand.
So one other strategy that really brings into inviting is that respect and reflect. So this is where we're providing the words to code the child's feelings, the wants, and their intended messages. So many of our kids use different modalities to communicate. They have approximations, they have gestures, sign, and they do a lot of this. So when that child communicates something with one of those other modalities, we're going to communicate the same feeling without making them repeat themselves on their communication device, or where we hear a lot when we walk into houses or classrooms, tell me on your talker, when they clearly understand what they're trying to communicate.
Yes, and I think it's really important for us to think about the respect and reflect, because many of our students and children do have some residual speech. They do use gestures, maybe some know sign language, and those are all perfectly valid modes of communicating. We want to encourage all communicative attempts. We don't want to discourage that and say, no, you need to say things only with the communication device, because we're all multimodal communicators. We all use gesture, facial expression, body language, etc. to communicate.
And so when we look at respect and reflect, following that child's lead enables the communication guide to continually respond to all the child's communicative attempts. This demonstrates to the child that his or her language has meaning while providing AAC language model. It shows the power of what they're doing communicatively. And just thinking about some of the ways that we can do the respect and reflect, and the example before is, how many times in a school can a child walk down the hallway and just point to the water fountain and a teacher would understand what they're communicating? So instead of saying, tell me on a talker, maybe they can model, I'm thirsty, want drink, drink. A couple of different ways to code that language.
So now we're actually going to try to show you a video. I know that this is going to be a little difficult depending on your bandwidth and where you are, but I think it's really important for people to see some strategy demonstration and action. That is one of the 8 steps that we use to help to teach communication partners. But I am going to do a little narration of the video before you watch it, so that those of you who are having trouble seeing it know what you are looking for. I am actually singing in a therapeutic session with a young man, and he really dislikes my singing. So he has an extremely clear gesture to tell me that he wants me to stop singing. He actually takes and he places his little hands on top of mine, and he looks right in my eyes. And I recognize that as stop. So I respect that, and I do in fact stop. And then I, on his communication device, show him how he could communicate the same thing if someone didn't understand his nonverbal communication. I use the symbolic word stop. And what you'll see is that later on in the exact same session, I forget and I start singing and gesturing again. And you'll see the look on his little face is, oh my goodness, what on earth is she doing? And again, he goes to gesture that to tell me to stop singing again. And I, again, respect that, and I say stop, and you'll see what he does. He actually goes to his device without any demand or with any prompt or cue, and he says stop on his device. So let's go ahead and watch the video together.
The horn on the west going beep, 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 all through the town. The wipers on the bus, swish, 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 swish. The wipers on the bus. Oh, stop! 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 Where the babies are. Stop! Just stop! Stop.
Okay, so thank you for all the technical support that's coming up. For those of you who are having difficulty, I'm seeing some of the messages in Slack about some AV issues. Thank you, Stephen, for helping out with some of those. Hopefully, it's not too bad out there. But that was respect and reflect, which is just another one of those input strategies that that we think is very important as an invitation. And then you see that when you acknowledge the student's intent and when you get it right, it's so empowering. He was so excited to say stop on his device that it created an opportunity. It invited him to be able to communicate that same thought on his device.
Another input strategy we like to use is the repetition, repeat. Frequently repeat those utterances. This gives our kids that use AAC systems a chance to see where it is, and also invites them to maybe imitate it when they see it over and over. And a lot of times when we do the repetition, we talk about you say it a couple times and maybe change it up with a little variety, but keeping your target word or target phrase in that utterance.
Yes, using repetition with variety allows us to model a target word. So for example, it looked like maybe your last session was on core vocabulary for those of you who attended that session. But for those of you who are doing a word of the week or words of the month, and you're targeting specific words, you can repeat those specific words, but with some variety. And using that variety helps our individuals who are using AAC to avoid getting into kind of rote or scripted utterances, but really get a chance to see the different ways in which some words can be used.
We also like to use build-up, where we repeat and rephrase adult utterances by adding elements to provide a more complete expression of the intended message. We want our kiddos to use longer sentences. For example, we might say bath time, and maybe that's where they're at the utterance, but we want to show them more words within that sentence. So we would say it's time for your bath. So we're going to add more elements upon the utterance level that they're currently at.
And I think that one of the things that new modelers find is that very often life moves quickly. So sometimes it's hard to model a complete utterance. So maybe you just say, eat cracker the first time that you're modeling. But then as the child continues eating, you have time to go back and create a more complete utterance so that the child can see more complete syntax, morphology, more complex language.
And the other strategy we use a lot is more of the expansion, more of the build upon the child's communication. So if our kiddo is maybe at that one word level and they say bubble, well, we're going to expand and build upon that with the comment like saying, oh, big bubble, more bubble, pop bubble. And when we talk about this build upon and expansion, we're saying we suggest only you adding 1 to 2 words beyond their current level.
Beyond the current expressive level, and simply from the standpoint that, you know, we want the child to be successful in being able to follow and imitate the model if they wish. And so that's a very attainable goal, 1 to 2 words beyond the child's expressive level.
So one of the last strategies we're going to talk about with the input is the pause, the stop, allowing that child time to respond. So often when we talk about modeling, a lot of our modelers, the beginning ones, become device hogs. But we want to create those invitations and opportunities for them to initiate, to respond to a question.
Yeah, someone in one of our sessions said, "Don't be a device hog." So now that terminology has stuck, but it does make sense. If you're only modeling and so excited about modeling that we're not allowing the child to get a word in edgewise on his or her device, we're actually defeating the purpose of modeling. We have to provide an expectant pause to allow the child time to respond. So let's talk a little bit about the what, why, and how of the expectant pause. What is expectant pausing?
So the what is, it's stop talking and modeling and gazing expectantly at the child while doing so. And this doesn't mean stare down the kiddo, but it is stopping and giving them a little chance to get an opportunity to communicate.
Because a natural pause in communication is a signal that we have that it's the other person's turn. And certainly eye contact is another natural cue. And as Matt had said, we really don't intend for this to be a demand. We can look expectantly, but not in a demanding way.
So why do we want to use the stop?
Students need to process what we have said. Then they need to formulate a reply and motor plan a response. One of the colleagues that we are working on our new research project on parent instruction in Partner-Augmented Input with, Kathleen Post, calls it mental gymnastics. When we hear something that someone has said, we don't need to fiddle around with a device and think, what group, what category is that in? And try to navigate to the page. And by the time we get there, still try to remember what the person had asked us. It's really that mental gymnastics, and that all takes time. So depending on the child, this can take anywhere from 5 to 30 seconds, and sometimes even longer for those students who use alternative access modes like scanning. We must stop or pause expectantly to allow the child time to communicate. After all, that's why we're modeling in the first place.
So what about how can we do this pausing?
Well, one of the things that we can think about are different places where we can strategically stop or pause before, during, or after a model to invite the child to take a conversational turn.
So we look at the pausing before. You pause before your model and avoid anticipating those wants and needs, or otherwise known as preempting. Even though you may think you know what the child wants or they're going to need assistance, don't anticipate. Allow that child an opportunity to advocate for himself or herself. If something is desired or required, give the student an opportunity to initiate communication by pausing.
So I'll give you an example of this. We sometimes see this in the cafeteria at lunchtime, where an instructional assistant might go ahead and unzip the lunchbox and take the straw out of the packaging and put it in the juice box and then set everything up ready to go in front of the student. But what would happen if we just put the lunchbox in front of the student? I don't know unless we try. In many instances, we might get a request for help or a request for a specific tangible item.
So what about pausing during a model?
Well, we can pause between words to allow the student to finish the phrase or sentence. This is similar to a close cue, but again, if the student doesn't finish the model, there's no requirement that they do so or complete the utterance. There's no requirement that they do so. So let's give an example of this.
So we can start the sentence. We all like to play with different toys and play with the iPad or bubbles or other things like that. But when we think about it, we might want to say on the communication device, start the sentence with play, and then stop talking or modeling and look at that child. pause and wait to see if he's going to finish that sentence, because a lot of times we don't know what they really want to play, but we're giving them the chance to invite them to communicate.
And if they don't finish it, then we can give our idea. Oh, play ball. Okay, let's play ball.
We can also talk about creating communication temptations.
This is something Weatherby and Prezant talk about, and they talk about creating situations that entice students to want to communicate, fun, playful sorts of things where the student needs to be able to communicate something in order to continue the interaction. So things like swinging, moving the swing and then allowing it to stop, or to be able to wind up a toy and then let it go and then pause. So how do we do the model along with the communicative temptation? Well, we pause after a model. So we produce a comment relative to the available object or action to entice the child to initiate communication. So I might model, make it go, and then wind up the wind-up toy and let it hop away and then stop. So I've provided the model of what the child might need to say to get the activity to continue, and then I pause. But again, if the student doesn't respond or say it, then I can go back and model it again and again and again, and I can repeat it until the child has maybe learned some of the language to be able to initiate that him or herself.
And so one of the examples that we might look at too, that we can think about, is that snack time. Right? This is something we know that happens a lot at home with the meal times, as well as in classrooms and schools. So something that we might do a lot of times after he already had some of the snack, we might also just want to model that comment like, ooh, I like cookies. And after that comment, you stop talking and modeling and just look at them expectantly. And as Jill said, if they generate a response on the device or the board, you honor it. And if not, go ahead and model it.
And we did talk a little bit about preempting, but I wanted to define that for you because I think this is something that we see, and it happens largely unintentionally. Untrained conversation partners may inadvertently restrict the AAC user's needs and opportunities to communicate by anticipating their wants and needs to the point that communicating is no longer necessary. And we do this in one of three ways. We can do environmental preempting. So this is when the physical environment is arranged so as to obviate any need to communicate. And that's that lunch example that I was explaining to you. So everything that the child would need to be able to have their lunch was already made available to them so that there was no need to be able to communicate.
We can also look at nonverbal preempting, inaccessible materials, events, and activities that are provided by others who anticipate the individual's wants and needs.
And lastly, as speech language pathologists, we are often guilty of verbal preempting. And I can say this because both Matt and I are speech language pathologists. But this is where we prompt. We either present a question prompt, we present choices, or we instruct the individual to respond before they can initiate messages of their own. So again, there might be some snack on the table in front of the child, and if we simply paused, they might initiate. However, we might inadvertently preempt verbally by saying, oh, we have crackers and pretzels, what do you want? And now we've taken away that opportunity to initiate communication.
So now we're going to show a couple more videos, and as we did before, we will talk a little bit about them. These are really short, 30 seconds or so clips. And in the first video, we have Partner-Augmented in the classroom. And this is a music therapist that is modeling with the group of classrooms, or a group of students, and there's two that use devices. You'll see her model with low tech and then go back onto the device and model through it. The things that you'll notice in the video is that she'll even model the path. And when she gets stuck on a word that she can't find, you'll hear her use the description word for the model.
Yeah, so she actually tries to find the word on her low-tech board. She says play sticks, but the word stick wasn't on the page that she expected to find it on the communication device. So she described it instead. She said play instrument. So let's go ahead and watch the video.
Play sticks. Yes, we're gonna play our sticks. Look, we're gonna play groups, music. You don't have
So it was really lovely seeing how she was very quickly able to adjust and use a description for the word that she was looking for. Also, as Matt had indicated, she was talking through the path. So she said, we're going to go to groups, music. So she was also talking through her navigating for the student to help the student to be able to find it. Now, this next clip is a lovely clip that was donated to us by two techie mamas. This is a mother-daughter, and actually mother and two daughters, who are coloring Easter eggs for Easter. And mom thinks maybe the Easter egg might have cracked. But again, the word crack isn't in the device. So sister, her sibling, suggests that that there might be a different word that they could use, and she comes up with the word break. So let's go ahead and watch this.
Did questions like did you hear that? There's a couple of did you hear that? Actions A to Z. I'm putting a green in you. Crack. Do we have crack? We've had a couple crackers. Yeah, you know what? What other word could we use besides crack? Break? Break. Yeah, did you hear it? Break. Let's look. See that one. Does it have a crack in it? Is there a break? No, I thought it would have a break in it. Yeah.
Okay, so you see how that was, how they very seamlessly figured out what to do when the word they wanted wasn't on there, but they're using the communication device just as they would their speech. And one of the things that I like to think about, we just got a question, kind of like a communication accomplice, sorry, not taking over communication, but providing support or no. And one of the best examples that we have of doing partner-augmented input is looking at a total communication environment for students who are deaf. So in a total communication classroom, we have teachers simultaneously signing and talking. And so really that's done as a way to teach that language. You know, it's that immersion environment, again, like we talked about in the very beginning. So the next piece that we've come up with to help you remember all of the input strategies is a mnemonic. Some of you might remember using various mnemonics in school. Mnemonics are simply memory aids to help you remember all of the different strategies that we've talked about so far. So if you see on the picture on the right, our mnemonic that we've come up with is SMoRRES. And we do know that usually SMoRRES does not have two R's, but we needed two R's for ours. And this is plural because, as someone had said in our recent training that we had given, you can never eat just one s'more. So we are actually going to do a little participation exercise in Slack. So we would like you to go ahead and type in to your message window. We're going to lead you through some verbal practice. Now, before we do that, really quickly, I just want to state why we do verbal practice.
So when we look at using verbal practice, it's a memory way, a way for us to remember the different checklist components that are required to provide partner-augmented input. A nice way to also give feedback when you're a coach into a classroom or a house. So when we look through that verbal practice, we can sit down and remember SMoRRES. Remember that M-O in SMoRRES. A nice way for us to do it. And as we go through verbal practice, the more times you kind of verbally remember the different steps, the more likely you're going to remember how to do the partner-augmented input.
Yes, think about when someone tells you a phone number or an address that you're trying to remember. What do you do to try to remember it? You say it over and over again until it becomes automatic, until you've remembered it. So let's go ahead. We're going to go ahead and switch to the next slide, and we are going to talk you through some verbal practice.
So we look at the first S in SMoRRES. The first S in SMoRRES is, and this is where we want you guys to type into Slack. This is something we do at all our training sessions and in classrooms and at homes.
Yes, verbal practice is one of the 8 steps, and knowing how to not only what the yes, we have slow rate. Anita typed slow rate. Knowing what it stands for as well as how to do it is exactly what we're looking for. So
Nice.
yes.
You guys are great. Now let's look at the next one, MO. So the MO in SMoRRES is for?
Okay. Oh, we're still a little bit behind on Slack. We're going to give you guys a couple of seconds. Modeling. Yes, we're seeing modeling. And the MO can be provided in 2 different ways using 2 different strategies. Yes, model, model, model.
So what are the 2 different ways that we can provide the modeling?
Okay, we see several people are typing.
Yes, parallel talk and self-talk. So far we got the first S for slow rate. The MO for modeling, they can be broken up into self-talk and parallel talk. The first R in SMoRRES is for? Great participation. Good verbal practice, so you guys can remember these steps.
Aha, respect and reflect, yes. And respect and reflect, again, is acknowledging all modes of communication and then coding those modes on the communication board or device for the student.
The second R in SMoRRES is for?
Again, we're seeing that several people are typing.
Repeat.
Yes.
We want to see those frequent repetitions so they can have a chance to imitate, but also adding that variety to show different ways of putting, so they're not getting so scripted.
Okay. And then our E stands for? Expand, yes, build up. So we want to make sure and not only provide 1 and 2 word models, we want to provide some clear and complete models of communication so students can see all of the different ways that we can use word combinations, word endings, etc. And then finally, the last S in SMoRRES is for? Stop. Yes, the last S in SMoRRES is for stop.
And remember, you can do it in different ways. It can be before, during, or after the model.
So we're going to share with you some resources that are available now in our last couple of minutes. And I don't know if we're going to have any time for questions, but of course, if you do, please feel free to type them into Slack at any time. But the first resource that we have up on the screen right now is from the Dynavox Implementation Toolkit. There is a free 20-minute video that is on Partner-Augmented Input. It's a very basic description of the strategy that is available for families, for speech language pathologists, anybody who goes to the site to view.
There's also a video in the Infinitec classroom in Illinois, Minnesota, and Pennsylvania, United States. They have access to My Infinitec, but you also can get this resource if you contact them. It's a little 45-minute, 46-minute video that brings in more of the components that we talked about today with some of the SMoRRES component description as well as demonstration.
Yes, places to pause the video so you can do some of the verbal practice, etc. We also have a Pinterest board where we have lots of these resources for Partner-Augmented Input. For those of you who are on Pinterest, I would encourage you to go and see some of the stuff that is there. We have our Respect and Reflect poster there. We have some articles and links to articles all pertaining to modeling, as well as links to videos that are available online.
We also have a Facebook group, Partner-Augmented Input in the Classroom. So if you want to go ahead and join this, it's a nice way to get some feedback for some of those that have started incorporating the 8 steps in their classroom, as well as the problem solve, kind of share the different ways they've added different elements to the training.
And we also have an upcoming full-day training that is being hosted by the Minnesota Speech and Language Hearing Association. It's Friday, September 15th, 2017. It's in Bloomington, Minnesota, and the link is available here. But this is actually where we do a train the trainer session, where we provide all of our forms in a binder format, as well as the video, the Infinitec video, so that individuals can take the strategies home and teach those in their home school districts.
And here's a couple of different ways you guys can contact us: through Twitter, through Facebook, Pinterest, our emails, as well as our websites.
And on the Technology and Language Center website, there is a section of downloads where you can actually find a handout. This S is for Stop is one of the most recent handouts that we've included there that talks about the expectant pause. So you can find all kinds of free downloads there as well. So thank you so much. I know we really only have a couple of seconds left, so if anybody has any questions, please feel free to type them in Slack. Our references are available in the handout as well. We greatly appreciate your participation.
Thanks, everybody.